I want to bring a big idea, a fundamentally fresh way of thinking about how the world works, and I hope to prompt you to change your outlook and way of approaching worldly questions. Let's start with defining the problem. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Today we would ask this question differently, but surely it is like an educated person today coming and asking, how do I make the world a better place? Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this and you will live. The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbour? It's the age-old problem, isn't it? How do I become a better person? Love your neighbour as yourself is called the golden rule. Most good people everywhere, even the worldly, would subscribe to this as a definition of what to do to fix things that are wrong in the world. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was travelling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbour to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. It's a story familiar to many of us. I've been reflecting over this and think Jesus has been even more succinct than we'd expect. He has hit on a really crucial question. You see, the premise here is, word that pastors don't say in church, happens. It's right, isn't it? It is the human problem. There are bad people. There are disasters that afflict people. Human-caused ones, system-caused ones, things people are born with, self-inflicted disasters, so-called natural disasters, and combinations of all of these. The world isn't always safe. So central to the big question, how to make the world a better place, is how to deal with misfortune that will happen to some members of society. It is a big question. It has been the question since Jesus' day. But let's get some perspective. Jesus talks about a solution, but put things into context. Jesus was talking 2,000 years ago. Suppose we represent that as 200 metres away, about as far as we can shout to each other if we're lucky. If you're middle-aged, say 45 in the same scale, it would make your lifespan just 4.5 metres. But realistically, our perspective on life is half that, about the distance of a conversation under social distancing cups of coffee. Frankly, most of what we know, or think we know, about how to make the world a better place is based on an even smaller snippet of our own experience. We sometimes think we have answers, but in reality we've only got hold of a small bit of the picture. In other words, we or others around us might come up with solutions like changes in government policy, social structures, programs, etc. Sometimes good ideas and sometimes bad ideas. Hitler thought for his time if they killed all the Jews it would solve everyone's problems. Obviously an evil, bad idea. You see the problem. Everyone is only seeing the piece in front of their own eyes. What else could you do? However, for let's say 200 years, 20 metres, more than our lifetime, but comparatively recently compared with how long ago Jesus spoke this parable, we have lived in a very different kind of world from Jesus, a modern world. Some nations perhaps a little less time in this modern world, and different levels of modernisation exist today. But it's in any case a lot longer than any of our personal experiences. Let me explain the modern world. It's partly about technology. machinery, tractors that can pull ploughs instead of oxen or people, transport vehicles, communication technology, factories. None of these things really existed 200 years back, but it's much more than technology. Before the modern world, government didn't really affect ordinary people's lives. There were few rules or standards, and what did exist was inconsistent and haphazard, while now our lives are governed by rules everywhere. Before the modern world, people experienced a very small world based on their own, usually rural community. But nowadays, a lot of people have a sense, basically true, that we're all part of one giant machine that dominates and directs every facet of life everywhere. Money wasn't so important before the modern world. In fact, most people grew their own food and just swapped that directly to pay for things that required specific skills. For example, the help of a carpenter like Jesus himself or a teacher. And they lived and they died at the mercy of whatever circumstances came their way. All very different from our world today. So, how do we fix our world? Let's look at a comedic view of this question from the TV series of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which satirised the modern world by imagining that it has been destroyed and someone is looking back with slightly bemused and irreverent irony.
This planet has, or had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper. Which is odd, because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. And lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move and that no one should ever have left the oceans. One day, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl, sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth, suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone, the Earth was unexpectedly demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass, and so the idea was lost forever.
Part of the comedy is to simultaneously poke fun at the modern world, at evolution, and at Christian faith. But did you get the reference to Jesus giving the golden rule? What about that girl in the cafe in Rickmansworth who suddenly came up with an answer? Well, that is kind of what I'm giving today, if slightly less grandiose and much less irreverent. You see, in this modern world, there have been basically two great big ideas to solve the problems that I described before of the world. Now you have to realise that I must by necessity simplify things. This is a short message. It's not a complete, thorough presentation dealing with every facet of an argument. No, this is something to challenge you with, and for God to speak into your heart and mind. You've got to take this and use it yourself. These two big ideas have been tried and experimented with for most of the last 200 years only. There have been endless variations on both, taking things to extremes and milder or mixed versions. Some of us may be adherents of a flavour of one of these two big solutions. If that is the case, I'm sorry I disagree with you. Your solution has failed. It's been tried and found wanting. Maybe not in your lifetime or experience, but somewhere, sometime in the modern era, it has been tried. Perhaps in an idealistic account you believe in, it worked and can be replicated, but you're wrong and you have believed a fallacy. It wasn't really like that at all. So let's look at my simple picture of these two solutions. And yes, largely in the modern world, as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy puts it, the solutions are all about money. The first solution, what do I call it? Basically, it is collectivism. It is the idea society as a whole has the answer. If we would only stop acting in our own selfish interest and act collectively, then we could solve problems. It has been tried in various forms. One of these is the idea that government intervention, rules, policies, state intervention and planning will make things better. Two forms of this idea are socialism and communism, that production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Or more extreme, all property is owned by the community and people contribute according to ability and receive according to need. I put these ideas in a positive light because the ideals are good ones and seem to hold great possibilities both for a just society and for alleviating many of the problems seen in society. And for that reason, the 20th century saw the rise of communist revolutionaries or activists across every country of the world. And I want to say, untold, unprecedented misery and suffering, loss of life, unparalleled oppression came about through this. But let's assume the underlying ideals weren't to blame for all that. What would collectivism look like in Jesus' story? We have a man beaten up by robbers lying on the side of the road. How do we help him? Well, I know. We will take a contribution from all travellers to then greatly expand the role of the inn. It will be the job of the inn to gather all injured travellers and look after them at the behest of our whole society. Do you recognise this as a solution we clamour for today? Great idea. But you see, there's a little problem when you put this into Jesus' parable. Of course, how will the inn find the injured traveller in the first place? Will they go and rescue him to bring him into the inn to fix him up? It ain't going to happen, and actually, no travellers will be happy with this idea. Now, it's moving a little outside my brief as a Bible teacher, but I feel obliged to comment why this doesn't work. The key idea of this collectivism, to give it its broadest label, is to help those at the bottom by redistribution of wealth. Those green pieces of paper as if they were the problem. But what happens is that each demand on this redistribution implies the exclusion of others from benefiting. Those others will demand some offsetting privileges elsewhere. Slowly, self-interest leads to ever-widening privilege, until too few are left to carry the load. Thus, there isn't enough leftover surplus to redistribute. What you end up doing is actually creating, then having to pay for a huge underclass of the disenfranchised, those who have no say, and unempowered, those who are trapped without the money to support them. Of course, along the way, there is always huge hypocrisy. Champagne socialists, they're called. Those who champion collectivism while reserving special privilege for themselves. So an indictment. But you know, the strangest thing is that there is an example of working collectivism, such that it is a model which lends hope. Such an ideal could work. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over all of them. And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshipped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. Actually, many times through history, even in the modern era, in the wider sphere of the church, collectivism has worked. And it has worked in a way that it has never worked in worldly society. The church in the world is a kind of laboratory, a place where ideal conditions exist. You know, a lab is sterile, no contaminants, to prove theoretical concepts. There are a lot of things that work in the laboratory, but translating into the real world proves much harder. Sometimes vaccines look promising in the laboratory, but in the field prove much less effective or become otherwise problematic. God created this universe, this world, and all its people. The church is the body of people that most represents, notwithstanding all our flaws, the way things are meant to be. In other words, the church is the proving place, the laboratory for exploring new ideas. Collectivism received its proof of concept in the church, but has not translated into society as a whole. Back to the modern world. Collectivism, in its various forms, had the momentum through until perhaps the 1980s, when its failure to make the world a better place, plus its flaws and hypocrisies, became more stark. Although memory is now fading and socialism appears to be making a comeback. But since then, collectivism has been eclipsed by the other idea. It's even harder to put a name on, but it has been called competition, free enterprise, private enterprise, capitalism, neoliberalism. With the disappointments of collectivism all over the world, countries as diverse as China and New Zealand decided the only way to make a bigger pie to share out was to give people economic freedom. In fact, the idea is that if you give people freedom, they will choose better than someone else can choose for them, and all shall thus be better off. On the whole, taking controls off people has led many to become better off. However, increasingly as time has worn on, we see that this alternative has not produced any better overall outcome than collectivism. Instead of collectivism, what has replaced it has been rampant selfishness, self-interest, me, myself, I. You see, it's at the heart. This is a kind of Darwinism, survival of the fittest, the law of the jungle. Those who adapt thrive. Those who are fittest, the strongest, who have the advantage grow even stronger and increase. However, the problem with survival of the fittest is, what happens to those who are not fittest? What about those who are unfortunate, have disadvantages and vulnerabilities? They simply become prey of carnivores. Survival of the fittest means some do not survive. Jesus posed his scenario of the man robbed on the way to Jericho. How to deal with those who have been dealt in. How would this free enterprise system solve the problem? Well, every person is responsible for their own future regardless. I know what we'll do. We'll give the victim of the robbery a loan. Then he can get himself to the inn. He can use the loan to look after himself until he recovers his strength, and then he can repay the loan once he is fit again. Great idea, but totally impractical. If the person was capable of getting themselves to the inn, they would have done so, and the loan will really only entrap them in debt for life. It's a shark-eat-guppy world. Hard. But in a sense, I guess it could be okay. After all, there'll always be inequality in the world, and maybe we should accept it. Except for the hypocrisy once more. The hypocrisy of this free enterprise, or whatever we call it, is that, of course, it isn't really free and equal. In terms of opportunity or accessibility, any way we look at it, the deck is stacked in certain people's favour. There is not a level playing field, and there is unfair privilege. Instead of each to his own, we have nicely cushioned conservatives or extravagantly livered liberals. It's not freedom, but self-interest and more privilege. But you know what? Once more, we find in the church a proving ground for this freedom of enterprise. This grand idea that things actually work best, not with collective control, but rather by setting everyone free to be themselves. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 12. The human body has many parts, but the many parts make up one whole body. So it is with the body of Christ. Yes, the body has many different parts, not just one part. If the foot says, I'm not part of the body because I'm not a hand, that does not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear says, I am not part of the body because I am not an eye, would that make it any less part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, how would you hear? Or if your whole body were an ear, how would you smell anything? But our bodies have many parts, and God has put each part just where he wants it. How strange a body would be if it had only one part. Yes, there are many parts, but only one body. The eye can never say to the hand, I don't need you. The head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. In fact, some parts of the body that seem weakest and least important are actually the most necessary. And the parts we regard as less honourable are those we clothe with the greatest care. So we carefully protect those parts that should not be seen, while the more honourable parts do not require the special care. So God has put the body together such that extra honour and care are given to those parts that have less dignity. This makes for harmony among the members, so that all the members care for each other. If one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. And if one part is honoured, all the parts are glad. It is the idea central to free enterprise, that everyone has a part and all are free to pursue their part, each with freedom and value. Some parts are more valuable, more honoured, but the harmony of the different parts means that none are exploited and all are protected because all members care for each other. It can work in the laboratory of the church, or at least it has a chance to be proved as a concept in the church. Again, it has proved a different case altogether to implement out in the world. Pointedly, Jesus, with his parable of the Good Samaritan, does not suggest a collectivised or a free enterprise solution to the problems of the world, does he? We, for 200 plus years, have dabbled across this money-based spectrum of collectivism to enterprise freedom, and always the solution eludes us, despite the example of the best outworkings of these two alternatives being tried in the church. This is where the succinctness of Jesus' thinking comes through. There has to be a third way, not merely a compromise or halfway measure, but a third way. It is the way Jesus actually points us, the Good Samaritan. It isn't about small pieces of green paper at all. It is about people to people. There is a third way. The Good Samaritan is better than either the modern world alternatives that have seemed the only way. Let's look at the characteristics of the Good Samaritan. Firstly, it didn't matter what anyone else thought of him. He didn't need qualifications, reputation, or respectability. Therefore, no one of you can be disqualified either. He took a risk. He got his hands dirty. It wasn't clean, easy, quick fix, then carry on. He committed to complete what he began. He would see it through to the end. He committed his own resources to completing the task. Here it does involve small pieces of green paper, but not just handing over cash. He put the man on his own donkey also. He came back to follow up. I have to say, these are not characteristics of ourselves or of our society. This is not modern society's solution to how to make the world a better, happier place, is it? Now, we already have Jesus' example of how this would work in ancient society in the parable itself. But what would this really look like today? What would we call it? Is it really distinctly different from either collectivism or free enterprise? After all, certain adherents of both probably claim to be Good Samaritans. This is different. So different, it is a third way. If I simplify things even more, then collectivism is all about you, some ethereal voice for all of society, you, telling you, everyone, what to do. The you tells you what to do. Free enterprise, on the other hand, is all about I. I will do what I want. The Good Samaritan is about I lifting you. Instead of both you or both I, it is I lifting you. And what does it look like? I found a great example a few years ago in the newsletter of the mission organisation Mission Without Borders. In a second, I'll tell you why I see this as such a great example. My life has changed, even at 77. Anna's husband passed away 2 years ago, and she found herself living on her own, as her children had already left home. At Christmas, she received an Operation Christmas Love parcel from the mission, which partners with the church community in southern Moldavia. At first I was sceptical about church. I'd grown up in a poor family and knew very little about God. Receiving the Christmas parcel softened my heart, so I went to church with a friend, and my life has changed, even at 77. God blesses us so that we can help others. So I don't sit alone and worry about myself anymore. Instead, I volunteer at the soup kitchen and visit needy people in the community. It's wonderful to talk to them and provide them with tasty food each day, which so many can't afford. I'm always encouraged when I visit them, Anna enthused. The first lady Anna visits is Lucia, who is paralysed and confined to her bed. She has no family, so she welcomes these visits. As soon as Lucia sees Anna, both women start to cry. I feel better when I cry, Lucia says. It means a lot for me to get visits from Anna. Although I can do so little, Pastor Boris encourages me that I can still pray. I'm more at peace now that I know about God, Lucia shared. A friend of mine came to visit me, who I had not seen for a while. She offered me some alcohol and I said, no, I don't want to drink anymore because someone is watching me. She said, who's watching you? There's no one here. And I said, God is watching me. Now I ask her only to bring me tea or coffee. Multiple problems addressed. And it's a great example because on the reverse side of this sheet, another quote, you, the mission, live what the communists taught in words, but didn't do in practice. Wouldn't it be great if we could also have it said, you Christians make happen what the neoliberals taught in words, but didn't do in practice? Because you see, the church remains the proven ground, the laboratory, the proof of concept. These things are not easy to implement out in the world. It goes against 200 years of the world's reliance on the spectrum of money-based solutions. In fact, until enough experiments and trials have run their course, the risk is too great to expect any great transformation. You don't test new drugs in live trials before they've been lab tested. You don't build a bridge or a high rise before a model has been built. You don't change society until God's people have set the example. So I'm not suggesting the world can be changed right away, just like that. You can't. But I think God knows things are not right with the world or with the grand experiments of the modern world. God's way is always to let humankind run our experiments until we prove to ourselves that we don't have any answer without him. Then he steps in. But you know how he steps in? He breaks the pot. If a clay pot is poorly designed such that it doesn't serve the purpose it is made for, you can only tinker with it so much because pots can't change. Instead, you break it, throw it away and start again. There is a prospect God may break the faulty pot in order that a new one can come about. Because it is inconceivable our modern society can choose anything other than the twin failed systems of collectivism or free enterprise. However, let me put it to you. Suppose there was a catastrophic disaster of some sort, something to do with the environment, or a worldwide economic crisis, or a global pandemic. Suddenly there might not be enough money. There might not be enough jobs, houses, food, safety, social welfare, rules and regulations, infrastructure or outside intervention. And then the only way will be for I to lift up you, or not to, and then you will die. A scary prospect, but it has happened before and it could happen. Look, disaster wouldn't build utopia either. It would simply change the paradigm we have lived under for so long we can't imagine anything else. Yet proof of concept happens in the church. Then field trials spill out into the world, and God ensures that. What I have challenged you with today is political philosophy. But what to do with this, the Good Samaritan idea from Jesus, is tested in the church. Not Good Samaritan as the world sees it through the blinkers of collectivism or free enterprise, but I lifting you. It is not about little pieces of green paper. It's not about giving your money, barely part of it. It is opening the eyes that would otherwise assume the church is a collective, or that everyone has their own job, and say, I will take that part. I will not walk on the other side of the road to keep my distance. I will take risks because it is safer here in the church to take risks with my personal insecurities than it is out in the world. When I start something, I will do all that is needed and I will complete what I began, and I will not worry about cost or risk. The cost won't really be much to do with money, but it will be to do with my pride, my independence, my biases and my priorities. It will be forging new relationships, not because of what I obtain, but because there is a need. It is a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. It is people seeing that need and resolving, I will help meet that need. It goes against not so much human nature, more as against 200 years of modern conditioning. To Jesus' listeners' pre-modern world, his illustration made much more sense. So humanity could unlearn this imprint that somehow the solution is about money. It's not about money, nor about doing away with money. Hey, this is the modern world. But it is about I lifting you. A person saying, I will get involved to do what needs doing. And if we in the church can start operating like Good Samaritans of the modern world, then this is what God will do. He will bring us into contact with other people outside, just as the Lady Anna was touched and in turn touched others. We will change lives no matter who they are. Early in the modern era, we did see many examples of such spillover. Bernardo's, Alcoholics Anonymous, the Sunday schools movement that simply was there to educate poor children who otherwise received no education. Christian initiatives that have in time lost that connection. It is a third way. Let us pray. Father, through your Son Jesus, you have shown us the path ahead. Let your people listen to his teaching. Let us follow him. The example, the teaching, the instruction, and the guidance he has given us is the way to fix this world. Let us see it, change us, and use us as your people, your own possession. Thank you, Lord. Amen.